Hello, my name is Aymen Rajeh, and you're watching the Arabic Hour.
Well, I'm really happy with the current efforts to raise these issues of, white supremacy and systemic racism and so on the streets post George Floyd. I mean, it's terrific to see young people so engaged in this matter.
Yes. Addressing racism and racial inequality in the U.S. is our topic for today. We are pleased to have Dr. Nancy Murray, a longtime civil rights activist who holds a BA from Harvard University and a Ph.D. in modern history from Oxford University. She spent 25 years as Director of Education at the ACLU of Massachusetts. Currently, she works with the Alliance for Water Justice in Palestine and serves as President of the Gaza Mental Health Foundation, Incorporated. Good afternoon, Nancy, and welcome to the Arabic Hour. Let me start by asking you to tell us a little bit about your personal involvement in the civil rights movement and your anti-racism work.
Okay, I am an American citizen, but I've lived a lot of my life outside the United States, and I think that's why I have such a real keen understanding of what has happened with racism in the U.S. When I was a student, I was involved in protests, civil rights movement protests, but I didn't really understand the depth of the situation until I went abroad. I did a graduate degree in England, which, as you know, is a sort of imperial power, failed political imperial power now. But when I was there, it was still getting over its imperial legacy. And then when I went to Kenya, which was a white settler colony, shortly before I was there.
Nancy, can you give us some dates and
yes.
when you were in the UK?
Okay, so I graduated from Harvard in 1967. So I was involved in a lot of the marches, not in the South, but in the North. We had solidarity marches with the civil rights movement. And then I left the United States in 1967 to go to Oxford University, and I was there from 1967 to 1975 when I went to Kenya, where I was for 7 years. And I would say my education about race really began in a big way in Kenya, because there I saw the impact of white supremacy in a very visceral way. Because although Kenya was an independent country by then, you still had whites-only signs on the racetrack, for instance, which they had. And it was so clearly this notion of that whites were culturally still in a superior position, and that blacks were considered, if not inferior, they certainly hadn't risen to the cultural level of whites. So when I got back to the United States in 1986, I should say that before I came back to the U.S., I worked at the Institute of Race Relations in London, combating racism in the media. So my understanding of the issue deepened from that experience. I got involved in the journal Race and Class, which at the time had people like Edward Said on the editorial committee. I soon became a member of the editorial committee. And then when I came back to the U.S., in 1986, I was really shocked at how the pendulum had swung back and how the whole discourse around racism had changed from the days of the civil rights movement. It had become very flat. It was seen that racism was basically people not liking each other. The whole guts of what a racist society really is in its institutional sense, that racism really determines how a whole society is arranged, how its economy is arranged, how all of the institutions function to keep one people, namely in this country, white people, superior and others inferior. We have really a caste system in this country from the very beginning. But that had been almost airbrushed away when I got back in 1986. There was very little sign of it. There had been a real effort, and I could talk more about this, but at the Supreme Court level, at the congressional level, to say, okay, the civil rights movement solved everything, and now we don't have to any longer care about this issue because now Black people have got it. They've got what they wanted. They're equal. Well, that certainly isn't true, and I'd like to talk more about that after you have a chance to ask another question. But I mean, we could see that from where we are today, how far we have to go.
And I just for our audience sake, I just wanted to mention that that Kenya was colonized by the British.
Absolutely.
Just for those that aren't aware of that. You know, speaking about the civil rights movement, in your opinion, why didn't that movement fully succeed?
Well, it succeeded in doing a legal remedy, in passing certain, two in particular pieces of legislation, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which did away with, in legal terms, segregation. And we could talk more about what that means, too. And then the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So it made two big legislative and legal advances. It got rid of the whites-only signs. It got rid of, you know, this notion that society could be separate but equal, which is what the Supreme Court had said in 1896. And only in 1964 did that notion of a separate but equal society get debunked and get basically, you know, it was said that this is no longer possible in this country. Only in the 60s did the 14th Amendment to the Constitution began to work. And if I could just, you know, go back and say what the 14th Amendment was. This is the amendment passed after the Civil War, a constitutional amendment that said all people have got to be treated equally before the law. All people have equal rights before the law. And that sounds, you know, like a great advance. However, the 14th Amendment didn't really start to be implemented until the Civil Rights Movement. Because what happened when, in the South, after the Civil War, there was this period called Reconstruction when it seemed things really were going to change. You had the 14th Amendment, you had various civil rights laws, you had Black people sitting in Congress, you had, you know, a whole new Black leadership emerging. But after 10 years, you had the racist white society becoming entrenched again, repealing so much through violence, through organizations like the Ku Klux Klan, basically taking away the right to vote that had been extended to Black people by that time, basically terrorizing people to make them keep their place. And they, you know, wanted what's called Jim Crow. They wanted a society where whites were on top, as they had been when African Americans had been enslaved. They wanted to return to that. And so the Supreme Court went along with it, and it said, right, the 14th Amendment says there's equal protection of laws, but that's just at the federal level. It's up to the states to decide whether and how to protect its own citizens. So although Black people are now citizens, the 14th Amendment has nothing to do with them because they really are, their treatment is going to be in the hands of state governments. And it was only until the civil rights movement of the 60s that the Supreme Court reversed itself and said, okay, in fact, the 14th Amendment means what it means. It has preeminence over what the states can do and cannot do. And we see that it's because of that that what we call the rights revolution took place. It wasn't just civil rights when we think of African Americans getting the vote and ending segregation, but the whole notion that the Bill of Rights is applicable to women, women's rights movement, to people with disabilities. You had all of these new Supreme Court decisions and laws using this new 14th Amendment, which gives real now power to the notion of equality. It's only this, after the civil rights movement reaches its point of being able to get these gains of ending segregation and voting rights, that we see people everywhere in this society began to get these same kind of gains for their own rights. Students' rights, for instance, come out of this. So what's called the rights revolution, when I say we call it the rights revolution, I worked for many years for the American Civil Liberties Union, and that is how we conceive of it. This is the Supreme Court underneath someone called Chief Justice Earl Warren. Thurgood Marshall was a member. It was a very different court from the court today. And in fact, when I came back to the United States in the 80s, the court was completely transformed and was busy undoing all of the gains that had been made in that period. And really, gutting the Voting Rights Act, gutting what affirmative action had been established through executive orders, basically, making sure that what was called the Brown versus Board decision, which desegregated schools, making sure that the desegregation of schools really would not take place. And we could talk about why, if you're interested. But so all of that was happening in the 80s. So in answer to the question, why didn't the civil rights movement succeed? I would say it succeeded up to a certain point. But then those gains were lost. And the really important gains that Dr. King recognized towards the end of his life. Dr. King's last act was to try to do something about economic inequality. And he had gone to Memphis to march with the idea was to march with sanitation workers in the I Am a Man march. Correct. Because he realized, he said, what good is it to be able to sit at a lunch counter if you can't afford the price of a hamburger? Yeah. So at the end of his life, he realized more and more that unless this incredible material division between, white society and African Americans was, some way of bridging that, all these other rights weren't going to be worth very much. So he started moving on that front. He got killed. It seemed for a while after his death, you must know, well, actually, we'll go into that a little later, but it seemed for a while that the society would begin to move to make some kind of effort to bring Black people into employment and so on. That's what affirmative action was meant to do. However, it never really happened that way. And in the 70s, what we see with the massive deindustrialization of northern cities beginning, we see far from Black people doing better economically, they started to do worse. The gap between whites and Blacks became even wider because they lost.
Why do you attribute that to? I mean, why?
Well, they had come north in the Great Migration of the 20th century and taken up positions in northern factories. The auto factory, all sorts of really hard work, which then went overseas by the 70s. A lot of those factories closed. Metal factories in Youngstown, Ohio, the huge smelting works and so on. A lot of that moved overseas. We had massive deindustrialization with the beginning of what is called global capitalism. And so that's part of the reason. There are, that's the sort of structural economic reason, but there are all sorts of other reasons to do with really the way the society never addressed the structural racist inheritance, which meant, all of the things that the government itself did to ensure that inequality, such as redlining, which basically allowed banks to put a red line around neighborhoods which they would not loan to. We had the federal government's.
You know what, Nancy? Let me just hold you right there on the redlining, and yeah. I've heard that term, and that keeps coming back. Every few years we hear about it.
Yeah.
How was that allowed to happen? I mean, how is it that a bank, and then these are not a mom and pop operation. These are banks that were across the United States, or at least were in big segments in multiple states and yeah. cities and so on. How were they able to? Was there like a policy that the president of a bank send a memo down saying, XYZ streets we're not going to loan to, or how did that happen? How were they able to get away with it?
So this question that you've just asked really addresses the heart of the issue. And the issue is a society which is entirely built on a caste system, a racist caste system. So it's not just the banks behave that way. The entire society behaved that way. The banks, let's take the banks. When the banks were getting powerful in the 1850s, their collateral was enslaved African Americans. They were the collateral that banks used. Slavery was the root of American capitalism. It was the thrust. We've been taught in our textbooks for years and years to think, okay, southern states had plantation slavery, northern states had industrial work, free labor, and the North outcompeted the South because it was more progressive, free labor, and so on. In fact, the system of slavery was the major engine of the entire industrial system in the United States before the Civil War, and the engine of the Industrial Revolution in Europe, because cotton was the basis of that. So when you go to banks, banks were lending, they were extending credit based on collateral and slaves. So slavery was very bound up with banking. And if we move then into the 20th century, during Jim Crow, all of these practices were, there was no problem with these practices as far as the federal government was concerned. In the 1930s, at the time of the Depression, African Americans were excluded from all the New Deal goodies. They could not do what white people could do. They couldn't get the same benefits from the government. They were not entitled to Fair Housing Act of, I think it was 1934, did not apply to them. So they were being, systematically excluded in the North as well as the South. And these practices like redlining were just taken for granted. Whites did not want to live with blacks because they said that black people brought down the value of property. So we have covenants put on the suburbs. When the suburbs began to expand with the growth of highways after World War II, a lot of these new communities like Levittown on Long Island, and New York was one of the model communities. It was only for white people. There were covenants. No black person could live here, and if you owned a house there, you could not sell it to a black person after, you decided to move on. So redlining, these housing restrictions and so on, that was the way the society functioned. And when we come to schools, it was the way the society functioned. Take a look at the effort to desegregate schools. What happened after the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court decision in 1954 saying you had to desegregate schools in the South. What happened afterwards was that the South said, we're not going to do it. What we'll do instead is have white academies. So white people, basically set up their own schools. What happened in Boston in 1974 with busing? A lot of white people said, we're not going to do it. So they set up their own, they took their kids out of school, sent them to private schools, sent them to Catholic schools, anything to avoid, this integrated school setting. So, it's so pervasive, the racism that we have inherited, that is really the essence, I hate to say this, but it's the essence of American democracy before the civil rights movement. I mean, no one really thought that anything else would work in this country. You did have, some progressive people here or there who were against it, but it just seemed to be taken for granted. Remember, if you think back to the Constitution in 1790, the first, new country, and 1790 naturalization law said only free white people can be citizens. Only free white people. And that did not change until after the Civil War. They finally had to say, well, black people who are here can also be citizens. But the whole notion of this as a white person's country persisted through the 1924 Naturalization Act, which was based on this notion of white hierarchy. Some white peoples are somehow, we're called Caucasian. The whole thing is so convoluted, but they had this name Caucasian for some reason. That was supposed to be the sort of root of the whites. But they had a hierarchy of, who are the really good Caucasians and who are the not so good Caucasians. And the not so good ones were considered the Slavs and the Eastern Europeans. And in 1924 Naturalization Act did not want them in the country. And, take Syrians. There were several cases before 1924 in like 1910, 15, where Syrians were trying to get citizenship, like of a country, of a state. I remember there was one, South Carolina had a court case. Should we give citizenship to this Syrian person? Does he qualify as white? Because only whites can be citizens. And, it became back and forth. Does he or doesn't he? The courts are littered with this kind of discussion because they couldn't figure out really what race was. And so, they had a dictionary of races which had these convoluted hierarchies of race. And it was a time of eugenics, when the notion of racial superiority was getting stronger and stronger. And so they wanted the United States, to be a white man's country. And that was true until 1965. You spoke a little bit and then some about, structural and systematic racism. Mm-hmm. And it seems like even though we had laws on the books that protected people, it really didn't matter. Because in practice, it didn't seem like anybody was truly following these laws to... Right. Well, this is where, the federal system becomes the complicating factor, because the laws were largely federal. They were made by Congress.
Correct.
And you had states' rights. We still have it now, but then it was very strong, the notion that, and I'm talking when I say then, post-Civil War, the southern states wanted to take control of their own destiny again. And so, they were the ones who would enforce these laws, and they decided not to. And there was nothing the federal government would really do until the civil rights movement forced them to do it, to step in. We had then, when there was an attempt to integrate Arkansas, the Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, we had Eisenhower sending the National Guard to force the state officials to allow these black students into the white school. But before then, the federal government wasn't going to do anything. it's so similar to now when we're all worried about our election. I mean, all of this boils down to Democratic Party in 1877 made a deal with the Republicans that we will let you, in this case, President Hayes, become president because the Electoral College was tied, if you will let us basically take charge of our own affairs by getting the federal troops out of the South. Because after the Civil War, the Union troops, the Northern troops, occupied the South, and they forced these changes. But then by 1877, this deal was made, the federal troops were removed, and we had the South beginning to terrorize, use terror to restore things to the way they had been. You know, with new black codes, with thousands of lynchings, thousands. And, you know, this is one of the really shocking things. I have a book on the shelf, which is truly shocking because it's called Without Sanctuary. And it's a book of pictures. And the pictures were all on postcards. This person had gone to a yard sale, a garage sale, and found this whole collection of photos of lynchings. And apparently, it was very common for when towns would have a lynching, some very gruesome, and some were hanging, some were burning people alive. They would take pictures and send them on postcards. Say, look what we had in our town. You know, we had a great,
Oh, wow.
exciting event. Yeah, it's a book called Without Sanctuary. It's pretty shocking. And you look around, and some of these took place in the early 60s, and you could look in the circle of faces watching, and there were lots of little kids watching. And, you know, if you think they were watching this, and they were maybe 9 or 10 years old at that time. I mean, they're now 70, say. I mean, they're still around. This country's past is very recent, and it really isn't past. And I found that out. Every year when we I started this program called Project Hip Hop. Hip Hop, I don't know if you could see this. Hip is Highway into the Past, History, Organizing, and Power.
Okay.
And we would take high school students on a 5,000-mile civil rights tour of the South in vans every year. We'd have about 3 or 4 vans. And we would go and meet with the people who made the movement, you know, the veterans of the movement, and also go to the places where all these amazing events took place. And while doing this, we would encounter these stories, which, you know, most people have not a clue about. And let me just show you the headline of one of the papers. We started a paper called Rising Times. And I don't know if you could see that headline.
Yes, I can.
I mean, we came to this house. Jesse Jackson, we got there before Jesse Jackson. I mean, it's quite by chance. We heard about it in the town. We went to a house where the 18-year-old son of the house was found hanging on a tree outside his house. This was in Mississippi. And on a bridge nearby, there was this racist graffiti. He had been dating a white woman. And his parents, who we were with, were convinced that they put him up on that tree.
And this was in 2000, the year 2000?
It's the year 2000. Oh, he was 17. This past June, just before Project Hip Hop was due to go south, a young black man was found hanging from a pecan tree in his front yard in Kokomo, Mississippi. So we went to Kokomo, and the 17-year-old popular straight-A student football player had everything to live for, but his life was cut short. The mystery surrounding his death hung over the small rural community. So we went there, we talked to his parents. Jesse Jackson turned up after us. And, you know, it was so clear because of all the racist graffiti and other things we found out about. We found out that in this part of Mississippi, there had been 60 jailhouse suicides under very suspicious circumstances. The lights would go out, We met with parents whose children had been arrested and were in jail and then were found hanged in jail. I mean, all of these things. We encountered in one school, one town, there had been in North Carolina this school where the principal was asked, they had an assembly to talk about the prom, and the principal said there can be no mixed couples at the prom. And a girl, one of the students, stood up and said, well, what about me? Who am I supposed to take? Because her mother was black and her father was white. And he said, you are the kind of mistake we are trying to avoid.
Oh, wow.
And this caused a furor, and the school got burned down. And we spent our time in the town interviewing students, the principal. We did this trying to really gauge what had gone on and what had happened. So, our trip south was not just a civil rights tour of the past. It was very much a tour of the unfinished business of the past.
Now, Nancy, what years were these that you were doing these hip-hop tours?
Okay. The first one was 93, and they went through 2001.
Okay.
And in 96, we actually took the students to South Africa. It was for the 20th anniversary of the Soweto uprising, which was when school children in South Africa rose up against the apartheid system. And we met Nelson Mandela, and it was, really great. In our Project Hip Hop trips, among other people we met, I don't know if you could see her, was Rosa Parks, who was there under the umbrella.
Yep, yes.
So we slept. Where this is the Lorraine Motel, which is where Dr. King was assassinated.
Okay.
From a bullet right across the street, killed him on that balcony. And we would stay. It's not a motel now, it's the Civil Rights Museum, but we'd stay sleep on the floor of the Civil Rights Museum and, really get just such a profound sense of the struggles that had happened. Now I'm so happy that what really, goes in waves. It seems that we're finally going to address our history and we never do, and then it goes quiet. Well, I'm really happy with the current efforts to raise these issues of, white supremacy and systemic racism and so on the streets post George Floyd. I mean, it's terrific to see young people so engaged in this matter.
Yes. We'll get to that in a second. I just wanted to ask you a question in regards to affirmative action.
Mm-hmm.
In your opinion, why do you think that? I'm not going to say it failed, but maybe it did. But to a certain extent, why didn't that work the way it was supposed to work?
Okay. Well, your question is interesting. You said the way it was supposed to work. In fact, the problem with affirmative action was no one knew how it was supposed to work.
Okay.
It wasn't a law. It wasn't a court decision. It was an executive order. It was it was a series of them. The first one, Kennedy, and then Johnson, and then Nixon, they passed various executive orders saying, well, we should try to hire more black people in this, or, So they were piecemeal. They were timid, and they never actually said what these were supposed to achieve. And so what happened, the idea behind them, as it became practiced, was that these were supposed to open up opportunities to people who had been denied them. So that included, of course, African Americans, but also women. And in fact, women did quite well out of affirmative action. But nobody really knew, okay, how far would it go and how would it be measured? I mean, how do you carry out something like this? And almost immediately, so that 1965 was what we think of as the beginning of affirmative action with the executive order of Johnson. But almost immediately in the 70s, the Supreme Court started putting restraints on what could and could not be done. You couldn't have quotas. You couldn't have set-asides. Finally, it was actually saying, you couldn't look at past historical reasons. You only had to look at the intent. If the intent is to discriminate. Now, how do you prove I intend to discriminate, so I'm hiring that white person? How do you prove that? So in other words, you could not use anything to really make the case that this job or this university seat should be given to a person of color, because that would mean talking about a history of discrimination, not just an intent of this person to pick that one over this one. So the Supreme Court really neutered it. And then you got this term called reverse discrimination in the mix, which, white people, especially in universities, started saying that affirmative action discriminated against them. So the Bakke case in 1978 was the first really big Supreme Court case, which heard this white student saying he did not get into university because, they gave the positions to black people, which he should have got. And the Supreme Court said yes. So, it never really had a chance. It doesn't mean it's completely dead, but what has happened is it's gotten this rather unfortunate reputation of being a special privilege. So if a black person now gets into a really good university, the society assumes that that's because of affirmative action, not because of that person's talents. And, so it's been undermined in a significant way.
It seems to me like, and this is, to be honest with you, I thought that Congress had something to do with affirmative action and not necessarily presidents. And so I'm going to guess that most people that don't really look into this matter are looking at affirmative action as the way I'm looking at it, that it was actually a law passed or something that says X, Y, and Z, and that's why I framed my question the way I did.
Right. Right.
And so people
go... perfectly good assumption to make, but in fact it was a piecemeal kind of thing with no clear agenda. Johnson just found something had to be done, and this seemed like a good idea.
Good idea to do it, and that's
women have benefited quite a lot from affirmative action because it really did open up all sorts of positions which had been denied women. Because I think various businesses and so on found it easier to say, "Oh yeah, we're practicing affirmative action. Look, we have, women." It's easier than somehow saying we are, going to integrate fully, which they didn't want to do. Yes. So I think it's important that everyone realizes that race is not really a biological concept. We share all 99.9% the same DNA. Race is a cultural, and it's basically a society-created construct. And to give you an example of how race operates in the United States, there is something called the one-drop rule. And in 1970, the state of Louisiana passed a law, state law, saying that if you had, I think it was 1/32nd African heritage, you could not be considered white. 1/32nd, okay? That's your great-great-great-great-grandparent. If you had one who was of African descent, you could not be considered white. So there was this woman called Susie Phipps, and in 1982, I believe, she went to court to try to change her birth certificate because her birth certificate gave her race as colored. The midwife put that there because the midwife knew that Susie Phipps's ancestor, before the American Revolution, had been an enslaved person who had a child through the southern white planter. And so therefore, the midwife put colored. This went to the court in Louisiana, and the court upheld it and said she could not change her birth certificate because according to the Louisiana law, she had a drop of black blood and therefore she could not be white. Now, every southern state had something similar to this. And by the way, the U.S. Supreme Court refused to take up that case and overrule it. Within about 4 years, that law, after the Susie Phipps case, that law was repealed by the Louisiana legislature. But that just goes to show, how completely constructed it is. It's socially constructed, and it was socially constructed in this case because the white slave-owning class wanted to be able to own the children that they were producing with their slaves. They had to be considered property. So they started, having these definitions of who was black to include people who had, in the end, very little black heritage at all.
Interesting.
Yeah,
interesting. You know what? Let's move on to present events. Why do you think George Floyd's death had such an impact, if you will? All the anger and frustrations and about racism to overflow.
It obviously wasn't the first time this has happened. Remember 2014 with Michael Brown's death? We had, I think, about 1,000 marches, and we had, huge events where Palestinians were sending advice to the demonstrators in Ferguson, Missouri about how you use, I think it was onions to keep the tear gas at bay, So this wasn't the first time, but I think 6 years later, in that interim between 2014 and 2020, the Black Lives Matter movement was organizing. Black Lives Matter grew out of the 2014 murder, and they were organizing, and by 2020, you had a lot of developments in this country. You had making connections between different struggles. This notion of intersectionality of struggles was much more developed than it had been ever since the solidarity movements of the 60s and 70s. You had, in the case of Palestinians, you had the movement for Black Lives Matter in 2016 had a big part of its platform about imperialism and about the Palestinian issue in particular. And so, add to that the pandemic and the frustrations with, just the whole way the world was run and the feeling that, capitalist society was getting it all wrong because things were getting worse for most people, and meanwhile you had the super rich getting richer and richer. I think, it was a very explosive mixture. But the fuse clearly was watching this man be killed over 8 minutes with the policeman just seeming so indifferent. Seeing that live was a shocking thing. People can hear and they can see pictures of, people getting shot with a gun. We see that in the films, action films and so on. This was a particularly, almost a mundane setting on a street with a car and just casual, having a knee on a neck and taking the life out of someone. So I think it just was it was almost like a cattle prod giving a shock to the body politic. Everyone just suddenly woke up to what had been said, but people really didn't understand, namely how police treat black people is just wrong. There have been so many uprisings in cities. Starting there first in 1964 in LA, and then 64 in New York, Harlem, 65 in LA, 67, they were all over the country, 45 people getting killed by the police in Detroit, and 68 after King died, over 130 towns going up in flames, all to do either, in the King case, the impetus was his murder, but in all the other cases, it was police violence and the way police were treating black people.
So how do we address these things? You look at it and you say, okay, this is one man that obviously was a police officer and he is white, stepping on or has his knee on a black man's neck. So how do we address it so that, because, I mean, most whites don't look at that and say, oh, well, that's, most of them look at it and say, that's wrong, that's totally wrong, it doesn't matter, that person happens to be a bad human being, be it he's a cop or whatever. I mean, how do you go about doing this so that people can feel somewhat safe and feel like they belong in the society as much as anybody else?
I mean, this is an incredibly good question, and I'm asking myself it practically every night. There's the incredible strength of the streets, which has been amazing. I mean, that's partly probably to do with the pandemic and people feeling they had to get out. But to me, it's been amazing because there have been so many young people and so many new voices. And by new voices, what I mean is grassroots voices, not this typical, elected politicians' voices and so on, telling stories of what they have encountered at the hands of police, telling stories about their family members in prison and so on. And it's been this amazing educational moment in this country. That said, you have to translate that into real change, and that, I think, is what your question is.
Yes.
And that is really hard, and that is what I am really afraid. We might, I hope not, but I could see the tendency to be, doing what we've always done, which was we make progress and then we go back. Now, in this case, going back would mean, in my view, not doing anything substantial. You can't just have, some basic token type solutions to this. Okay, so on one hand, you have the big demand of defund the police, and that is, as a slogan, off-putting because no one knows what it means, and they think, we need the police. I don't think if you talk or look a bit deeper, what defund the police really means is that. What it really means is reconsider how we keep ourselves safe. Basically, we put people who have mental illness in prison. We have the police being the person who has to deal with someone who is mentally ill. We have to take money away from overinflated police departments, and there's plenty of room for that. I mean, all the SWAT teams and this and that, they can be shrunk and put it into these community service organizations, put it into mental health, put it into all sorts of other ways of dealing with public safety issues. So that's one thing that communities are trying to do. So part of the solution, I think, is going to start at the town level, the municipal level. These changes can be made at that level. Getting up to the bigger level, which is the level of, Congress legislating. I mean, right now, we do not have a Congress that can move on anything, as I'm sure you know, which is really too bad, because there could be answers to this, and I'll give you a few of them. Right now, it is not even mandated that police departments give to some agency a list of how many people have been killed by police in their department. It's all voluntary. We can start by really getting a handle on how many people are killed every year and why. It's over 1,000 every year, considerably over 1,000, but we don't really know. I mean, there's police departments don't really have the kind of oversight they should have. We can go further. We can stop militarizing the police. Right now, there's this thing called the 1033 program where, because we've been, fighting all these wars for so long, we have all this military hardware they have to get rid of. All you have to do if you're a police department is say, I would like, I'd like a tank, I'd like this, I'd like that. You get it free under the 1033 program. All you have to do is pick it up. There is one other thing that says you're supposed to use it within, I think it's 2 years. But people, these police departments have got these weapons that they shouldn't have, they don't need. It's changed their mentality because they think of themselves now as occupying forces or soldiers when they're looking like soldiers. So there are things we can do, and I think Obama tried to move in that direction. He made some reforms to the 1033 program, but I think we could go much further with that. Basically, what we have to do is make people feel the police really are not there to contain them, to occupy them, but they are there as agents of public safety. And, that in Black communities just has not been the case ever, because the police grew out of the slave patrols. That's their roots. So if you were a Black person, your experience of police for generations has been, they are not my friend. So there's a lot of, real root and branch stuff that has to be done, but most of it, I think, has to be done at the municipal and state level. In Massachusetts, we don't even have certified. The police aren't even certified. We could start by certifying the police.
Isn't there more to this than just, now of course, we can reform the police, but if society in general doesn't change, how do we reform society to overcome this?
Yeah, great question. I think we really see the heart of this with the whole debate over guns in this country. The way that after these mass killings, at Sandy Hook, here, there, we could not do anything. We seem incapable of really moving forward in a healthy way. So I think that's a great question. I think this is to change a society is going to take a really long time. And one of the things it's really going to take is a change in the education system. There's a book called Lies My Teacher Told Me by Jim Loewen is the man. And if you read it, the way America has been presented to school children, the way race in America has been presented to school children, we all grew up with this. It was so distorting that you really have to start presenting history. History has to be taken more seriously. And so people could understand why this society is the way it is. And they have to want to change it. It has to be something that the next generation really sees. We have been not our best selves. We can do this in a different way. I don't think we can impose it, because by imposing this kind of change, what we see now, we have all these dangerous militias, scary stuff, like the Boogaloo Boys and all these over 1,000 armed militias. We could push this country, given the extent to which we are armed, into a real violent conflict. So,
and we'd like to avoid that.
Absolutely. We would certainly like to avoid that. So I don't think there's an answer, a quick fix to this. But it is, education. We have been miseducating people in this country for such a long time. We don't want to think of ourselves as having flaws. We are, the exceptional nation, et cetera, et cetera. That's how we want to think of ourselves. Well, we should get real about our history. And then maybe people will say, God, we could be much better than this. But I don't see, other than that, it's got to be persuasion. It obviously can't be, go logger.
Maybe if we can kind of listen to one another, number one, and let's be intellectual when it comes to this stuff.
Yeah,
and we've lost that. That seems like that's gone. And unless we get that back, I don't know how you can move forward.
Yeah, it's harder today, I guess, than it used to be, because it used to be you had 3 television stations, and, back in the 50s, you'd turn one of them on. You'd more or less be getting a same view of the world. Unfortunately, the view of the world wasn't always a truthful one, but, it brought people, it had a unifying force. But now, especially with the internet and the ability to just go into polarized directions, and all of the conspiracy stuff and the untruths, and very hard to figure out how to do public education which can actually deal with the real world around us in a way that brings people together. I mean, I noticed that is the theme of this Democratic Party convention, unity. How do we build unity? It's got to happen, because otherwise, this country...
Well, we'll destroy the country if we don't do that.
Yeah. Well, we shouldn't be too alarmed in terms of thinking this is the first time this has happened. Obviously, it isn't. We've had a civil war. We've had so much conflict. So somehow we've managed to get beyond it and keep going. So this is like a repeat. But, we have to see, hopefully, reason will prevail.
Well, Nancy, we've got a few more minutes, and I wanted to ask you, is there, today as things stand, is there some type of policy that a president might be able to enact to make some real change, or to start making some real change when it comes to civil rights?
So here's the thing. I think what we really need to do now, we've seen through COVID these giant gaps in health, education, employment, who's dying. We've got to build on that, and we've got to figure out a way to narrow those gaps. And so, I would say, just number one, we've got to make sure that people have health care, that people aren't going to just die of COVID because they don't have access to health care, or they can't afford health care and they're afraid to go to a hospital because they know they can't. These are basic things that every other developing country has managed to do, but we haven't. So all these divisions, they're not exclusively white and black. It's not like whites have it all and blacks don't. No, of course not. I am from the state where I'm heading tomorrow, which is West Virginia, which is the poorest state in the country, Trump country, and most people there are white. And, they're in pretty bad shape. In some counties, there's not a single grocery store. They buy food from gas stations. The methamphetamine, addiction is enormous. These are the former coal miners and so on. So we've got to somehow try to help people to see that we could solve problems if only we were united and used our incredible wealth in a different way. Right now we give nearly $800 billion every year to the military. Why don't we not do that, but instead take some of that back and, have health care, have college that people can afford, really start thinking of community welfare instead of just, let's dominate the world and the skies, the space command. So I think there is a lot a president can do, but it's going to take getting away from this this mantra that, that's socialism, we can't move in that direction. What countries in Europe have, you could call it socialism, but it's really social democracy. It's ruling, with people in mind, not just with world domination in mind. So I think there's plenty, that might not address directly the race issue, but it comes around to it. Now, and there's another thing Congress could do. There has been this bill in Congress called H.R. 40, which says we should set up a commission to study the issue of reparations. It doesn't say we are going to have reparations. It says we should set up a committee to study it. It's been in there without being passed for years and years and years. I would hope it would be passed, and the whole effort to study this issue and figure out how to make some kind of amends for 400 years of slavery and segregation that really does start to heal some of these divisions. And I think, you could say, well, how can it heal them? It'll just make it worse. because white people will feel they're being cheated. Well, I think it can be done in a way which brings people together. But we have to start studying it. So there's lots to do. We just have to get off the track we're on right now.
Yes, of course. There's so much to do, and Nancy, I would. There's so much more that I would like to talk about, and I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the Palestinian issue and the similarities, if you will, between what blacks go through as far as their experiences with the police and what Palestinians go through with their experiences with the military, the Israeli military there. I know that you've had some interaction with the occupied territories and know a little bit. I'd like you just to maybe tell us a little bit about that before we have to go.
I paid my first trip to the West Bank and the Gaza Strip in 1988 as part of a fact-finding mission, a human rights fact-finding mission during the first Intifada. And I've been there maybe 20 times since then, about 14 times to Gaza, and seen how the situation has become ever more dire. Ethnic cleansing, just the terrible dispossession that is going on in the West Bank and the strangulation of the Gaza Strip for 14 years now. And I fully endorse the term applied to the Gaza Strip, to Israel's policy in the Gaza Strip by Ilan Pappé, the Israeli historian. He calls it a policy of incremental genocide. You could see the treatment of the Palestinians. It's in ways very similar to the treatment of the Native American population in this country. We haven't talked about that, but that is our other original sin, a form of genocide against the indigenous people. And that is what has been going on, certainly in Gaza. I'd call it more ethnic cleansing of the rest of Palestine. So there are huge similarities, and these similarities were seen by civil rights movement members of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, who embraced the Palestinian cause in 1966, 67, which got them a lot of enemies. They were seen by Malcolm X, who visited Gaza in, I believe it was 1964. So there were connections, and partly those connections were born of this solidarity movement among the countries in Africa which were seeking their liberation, in the Middle East seeking liberation from colonized situations. And of course the Palestinians were a prime example of that. So, all of those similarities are there in the history. The connections were there in the history. There's been a lot of attempt in this country to say, BLM, Black Lives Matter, you cannot talk about Palestinians. There's been a real attempt to shut down the groups that want to make those connections. But those connections are still being made. And the Dream Defenders, which is a great group, a Black African-American group out of Florida, they're one group that's taken members to Palestine, African-Americans. I've taken delegations with a group called Eyewitness Palestine, which used to be Interfaith Peace Builders, and many African Americans there as well. And so once people see it, just like, they're shocked. It's like when South Africans go to Palestine. In many cases, they say this is worse than apartheid ever was. So those connections are very strong. The fact that the American police, over 1,000 of them, have gone and trained with the Israeli police. And the Israeli police are a paramilitary police force. They're militarized, and they're an occupation army. I'm not in any way suggesting that it was that training which causes the kinds of actions taken against George Floyd and so on. And no. We have our own long history of police violence directed against Black people. But it just goes to show similarities, similar approaches, and connections which will continue to be made as long as Palestinians are so oppressed as they are at the moment. As far as civil rights go, the whole notion of now that two states has been made more or less unviable by settlement expansion and so on, going for a one state, some kind of entity, and then having a civil rights struggle within that state. Well, given how long it's been and long this one has been,
yes,
and given how entrenched the antagonisms there, I don't know how that would work. But personally, I embrace freedom, justice, and equal rights for all as the way forward. When that's, obviously means a civil rights struggle, but it's also a human rights struggle.
absolutely.
Because right now, Palestinians their human rights are being just completely violated.
And maybe a one-state solution might begin to solve some of these problems, but we'll leave that for another day.
Yes, okay.
Nancy, thank you very, very much. I greatly appreciate your time and being with us today. It was very informative and very educational to me. I greatly appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Okay. Well, thank you, and thanks to Arabic Hour.
You're welcome. That's our program for today. Thank you very much for joining us. On behalf of the volunteers here at the Arabic Hour, this is Aymen Rajeh, and I look forward to seeing you soon.